Um, Welcome to Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site and the Searchlight series for June of 2021. I'm Sean Kelly. I'm the Senior Vice President here, and I want to welcome all of our guests. I'm going to just do a quick introduction about the site for people who may be new to Searchlight, and then we'll get to our conversation. This is the Searchlight series from Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site in Philadelphia. This building was built on farmland outside of Philadelphia. Today it's surrounded by skyscrapers, but it used to be out here on this lonely hilltop, designed to look like a castle from the outside. And the original system has this very distinctive wagon wheel floor plan. The original system was solitary confinement. We'll talk about that tonight with our guests. That's the conversation we're having here tonight. This building was known for solitary confinement. It was designed with the belief that people could be improved, that people could be made penitent if they were held in solitary confinement. It was inspired by Quakers as well as other religious leaders with the belief that solitary confinement could be beneficial. And so this building was copied all over the world. There are hundreds of copies of Eastern State Penitentiary built where the architecture expresses this belief that solitary confinement is good for you. It's crazy we're having this conversation tonight because they eventually realized here in Philadelphia, this is an illustration from Charles Dickens' book, where he devotes an entire chapter to Eastern State Penitentiary and talks about what a terrible idea it is to put people in solitary confinement. That was 1842. Someone was saying solitary confinement is a terrible idea. The building was copied all over the world, but eventually they gave up solitary confinement. And so they scaled it back and finally gave it up altogether. So here's a Christmas celebration. The guys in the stripes are obviously incarcerated here. This basketball team in the 1960s, I'm guessing. And finally, this building closed in 1971. Actually closed as a state prison in 1970. This is the last group of people leaving Eastern State Penitentiary being transferred to Graterford, and this building became abandoned, and it's sat here for decades. Today we give tours. We bring through, before the pandemic, about 30,000 school kids a year. We talk a lot about what prisons are for. Do prisons work? What are we trying to accomplish? How can we do better by the people, by the communities that we're trying to improve? We have art installations. This is Diane Rogers' installation called #BlackGirlhood. We have this graph that tracks mass incarceration starting in 1970 when this building closed, roughly, was when mass incarceration really started in this country, and showing the comparison to all the other nations in the world. The companion exhibit to the big graph is called Prisons Today, and it asks fundamental questions about how we decide who gets away with it and how we decide who doesn't. We have an ongoing series of virtual experiences. This is our Prisons and the Pandemic. It's a news roundup of how COVID-19 is impacting incarcerated Americans on Fridays on Facebook. We are proud Fair Chance employers. So this is our Returning Citizen Tour Guide project. If you like what we do at Eastern State Penitentiary, I'm required to tell you that you can support us by going to our website and support. Thank you to all of our members who make Searchlight free. Next month on Searchlight, the topic is a disturbing topic, but really important. The sex offender, we put that in quotes, the sex offender registries in the US. Please join us 1 month from tonight, Tuesday, July 6th for Searchlight. Tonight, our guests are all from the Abolitionist Law Center. Cynthia Alvarado served 12 years of a life without parole sentence for a wrongful conviction and was released from prison in 2019. She's an agitator and an Instagram influencer. I saw her just posting to Instagram right before we went live here, and focusing on issues concerning the criminal justice system. Welcome, Cynthia. It's so great to have you here. Our old friend, Robert Salim Holbrook, is the executive director of the Abolitionist Law Center. Prior to being named executive director of ALC, he was its director of community organizing, responsible for expanding ALC into Philadelphia. I saw Salim at many Searchlights as a guest, and so it's only a matter of time before we got you on the show. Salim, it's so great to have you here. Thank you for being a guest. And Donald Reese is a member of the Human Rights Coalition and the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration, formerly incarcerated here at Eastern State Penitentiary at the age of 17. He served 40 years in prison. He's presently a community activist in North Philadelphia. And I just want to say that we've been doing Searchlights for many, many years. Abolitionist Law Center really brought it tonight. You guys hosted a rally in front of Eastern State. This photograph is like an hour ago. hosted a rally in front of Eastern State Penitentiary to end solitary confinement in Pennsylvania, including this very disturbing recreation of a solitary confinement cell. And I'm telling you, if you walk into this thing and close that door, you get pretty, pretty, pretty agitated right away. So with that introduction, I'm going to start. If you have questions for our panelists, please enter them in the Q&A. We're going to talk for a while, and I'll keep an eye on the Q&A and eventually start pulling some questions from social media from the Q&A. So please ask any questions that you have. I want to start by saying that I've never been incarcerated, and I don't ask people if they have been. And if I happen to know they have been, I try not to ask prying questions. However, I did ask all three of our panelists tonight if they minded talking about their experiences with incarceration. All three are very public activists, so I wasn't surprised, but I wanted to make sure it was okay. Typically, it's not considered a polite thing to do. But before we talk about policy, let's talk about the human experience of incarceration, particularly if you've experienced solitary confinement. So, and we will get to policy, trust me, and we have a lot of things to discuss there too. Cynthia, just going to go alphabetically. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences with incarceration, and were you ever held in solitary confinement during your wrongful conviction?
Yes. So first, I would say that my incarceration was the worst experience of my life. I served 240 days in solitary confinement, and the moment that I was placed into the cell was the first time that I was ever held in solitary confinement. When I was first arrested, my case was on the news, and even though I wasn't convicted, I was placed into solitary, and the officer just closed the door. At that moment, I just remember thinking, what the hell's happening? Like I couldn't, like my mind could not wrap around the reality that I was experiencing. I started to pace the room, and I started to just panic. I was completely isolated, and honestly, by like the third hour, I just started to contemplate suicide. I started to think about like where would I hang myself in the cell, and um it's very emotional when I talk about it because it was the worst experience of my life. I never ever been so isolated in my life. You know, I didn't have anybody to talk to. I didn't have a counselor, a therapist. I didn't have a roommate. There was like nobody. Um, I was a product. I was raped by a prison guard once I was released from solitary confinement. I was physically beat by guards while in solitary confinement. My co-defendant escaped from the maximum security prison where he was being held right next door to my jail, and because he was gone, the officers took out, you know, their rage out on me. So not only was I locked in for 23 hours a day and I was fed to a slot, I was also physically abused by the guards in retaliation of my co-defendant's escape. I wanted to just kill myself, and those are thoughts that I push out of my head today still because you know it's revisiting those moments are I'm forever scarred, if that makes any sense. I've seen some of my comrades upstate end their lives while in solitary. I've seen them denied meals. I've seen them eating their own feces. Things that you know I can never erase out of my mind, even if I try to. So solitary confinement is mean. I was denied tissue by the guards, and you know, go to sleep hungry. If you go to sleep during dinner, you miss a meal, and you may not eat the next morning because you might be too depressed to wake up. So solitary confinement is horrible, and I want to see it completely abolished, and that's why I'm here today.
Thank you for sharing that. I That is extraordinary. I'm so sorry for all that suffering. Um, I'm always reminded in these moments that this is taxpayer dollars. So when I say I'm sorry, like this is all of our taxpayer dollars that paid for that treatment that you went through. I'm so sorry. Thank you for sharing that, Cynthia. Where that was in a Pennsylvania prison?
Yes, I was in a RCF was my county jail, and that's where I was physically abused by the guards, and I was actually raped by a prison guard, and there was no justice for me at all. I was sent to state prison where the statute of limitation on rape had expired, and because I was too afraid to come forward, there's no legal recourse for me. there's no punishment for the guard. And yes,
That's a
um,
Riverside Correctional Facility, the
yes,
Philadelphia County Prison.
and it's county jail. Yes, I was before I
Oh,
was convicted and sentenced to life of state, where of state I witnessed the inmates just hanging themselves while in solitary, and just you could see them go in normal and just come out and you don't even recognize them. And that's when I realized that I was living in hell. I couldn't even believe at times that I was an American, because that's what solitary felt like. It felt like I was in a third world country and nobody cared about me. Nobody cared about me. It's like
and
the worst feeling ever. And that's why I do what I do, because I can't get those thoughts out of my head, or the suicides that I've seen, and simply over a meal, simply over just, a denial of tissue or something that's just so basic as a human. And it's just horrible. We're hurting people as Americans, and that's why I'm here, so that we could end solitary forever.
thank you so much for sharing that. And you're very brave to come on here and tell that story. Thank you. But people do need to know this is what happens behind these walls. Salim, can you tell us anything that strikes you as, are there any echoes in Cynthia's story with your own, or things that are different?
Certainly echoes. There's a part of me that wants to say there are some things that's different, but they're not, because one thing I realize is that in solitary confinement, every person experiences their own form of hell. For me, I first went to solitary confinement when I was 17 years old for refusing to obey a direct order. During my 27 years of imprisonment, I did a total of about 10 years in solitary confinement. The longest stretch I did was 3 years in solitary confinement in the state special management unit, where I actually met Mr. Reese in the mid 90s. And I was a kid. I was 21 years old then. The thing about solitary confinement is that people have the impression that most people who go to solitary confinement, or all people who go to solitary confinement because they're dangerous, because they're Hannibal Lecter-like, because they assaulted someone, stabbed someone, tried to escape. That's not the truth. The reality is over 85% of the people who go into solitary confinement are going into solitary confinement for a simple rule infraction, which could be everything from passing food during dining hall, stopping to talk to your friend during line movement, passing a book to read before you lock in for the night. And this is what lands people in the hole for 30 to 90 days. And then when they get into solitary confinement, because of the conditions in solitary confinement, many of them suffer mental trauma. Many of them suffer mental breakdown. Many of them act out, and they wind up accumulating more hold time because they keep getting misconducts because of that. And so you could have someone who went to the hole for 30 days or 90 days wind up staying a year and a half in the hole because they slept through count. They weren't on the door for shower, or because they tried to pass a book under the door to someone who wants to read, right? So this is something that I find really disturbing about solitary confinement, is that prison is an environment that really tells you to mind your own business, do you, be selfish. But what we see with solitary confinement is the people who land in solitary confinement, a lot of the infractions they get are actually trying to seek out that other human contact by passing a book, sharing envelopes to write your family with, sharing writing paper, right? Sharing food. But this is prohibited because if they catch you passing that, if they catch you sliding that under the door, that will get you more hold time. So I've experienced, for me, it's not about what I experienced. I think back to what I witnessed. So I witnessed people hang themselves, right? I watched someone go out in the yard in the middle of the afternoon, walking around in circle, looking up at the sky and saying, "Why is the sky red? Why is the sky red?" We recognized something was wrong with him, but the guards just took him and put him back in his cell. Later on that day, they found him in his cell. He hung himself. I think of people who cut their veins open with razor blades because they needed to speak to someone, to speak to a psychiatrist, right? I think of people who I knew for years, having conversations with them and watching them deteriorate in front of my eyes. One thing I realized is that when someone, for lack of a better word, loses their mind or goes out of their mind, there's no coming back. I've never seen anyone come back. And people that were totally all right, totally normal, intelligent, witty, sharp, just became a shell of themselves, would become paranoid, would become incoherent, would become delusional. And that was, for me, was just really depressing, like watching someone I know just go on this steep decline and me sitting there like trying to talk to them, bring them back, pull them out that hole, but have to come to the resignation that they're gone. There's nothing I can do for them, and there's nothing that a psychiatrist or a system can do for them. Because like I said, once you fall into that abyss, I haven't seen anyone come back normal. So those are just some things that just really resonate with me, the human trauma of it. And it's not something that's needed.
Yeah, well, let's get back to that in a few minutes. That's you're leading me into one of my next questions. But Mr. Reese, thank you so much for returning to Eastern State Penitentiary. I don't know. We've had over the years many people come back into this building who've been incarcerated here, and it seems like it's different for everybody. Some people don't bat an eyelash, and some people find it very upsetting. But anyway, I really appreciate you being here with us tonight. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences with incarceration, particularly if you were ever held in solitary confinement?
Yes, I was held in solitary confinement in this institution at the age of 17 for bringing 2 slices of bread out of the chow hall. Solitary confinement is the most horrendous or horrible experience I ever experienced. I got locked up at the age of 16, and at the age of 17, I was sentenced upstate. And this is the first facility that I had to come to. That was in 1967 when I got incarcerated. I came here in 1969, March of 1969. Most of my time of being locked up, most of it had been in solitary confinement. The longest I ever done at one period in solitary confinement was 8 years straight. That was for teaching a group of young guys Black history. They gave me a write-up because they said I was preaching religion to these individuals in the yard. I was teaching Black history, and because I taught Black history, they considered me a threat because they wanted to keep people ignorant and dumb. So they placed me in solitary confinement, and I did a total of 8 years. I seen people lose their mind in solitary confinement. I see people hung themselves. I seen people, as the 2 individuals just stated, I seen people totally regress. I see people go in there that was of sound mind, and they came out and they was insane. And another thing that I saw was they tried to medicate you. They was always willing to give you medication, and this medication was, I thought, was mind altering. Because all it does is it suppresses the individual. It doesn't help the individual, it's suppressing. Coming through these doors, I got all kinds of flashbacks. And ain't none of it's good. But I would say this: solitary confinement affects each and every individual. I don't care who you are, on certain levels. It affects everyone on certain levels. You don't go through, you don't go in solitary confinement and come out the same. You're gonna always have that horrific experience, that memory. I don't eat meat. I stopped eating meat in 1968. I was about 17 when I stopped eating meat. So when you place someone like myself in solitary confinement who don't eat meat, I would go days and days without being able to eat a complete meal. Sometimes they would deny me meals. They would deny me meals because the guard may not like me. And so I would go days without eating. You're supposed to get an hour a yard while you're in solitary confinement. You might not get that hour a yard because a guard may not like you. When I first entered the penal institution, when you go to solitary confinement, they would take your mattress. At 6 o'clock in the morning, they would take your mattress from 6 in the morning until 9 at night. It's the most repressive thing an individual can experience, to be in a cell about the size of a house bathroom. And you're in that cell for 23 hours, or one time, you only used to get a 15 minutes yard. To be placed in that and not knowing when you're gonna get out. Sometimes they give you 30 days. Sometimes they give you 45 days. Sometimes they give you indefinite. So you're not knowing when you're gonna get out. Guard can come by and take a list for yard, and you didn't get to the door quick enough. He walked right by you. Or say this guard, he don't like you for any particular reason. He won't sign you up for yard. So you in that cell for 24 hours. It's real repressive.
8 years. That's unbelievable.
But I did a total of probably about 30 something years in the hole. But the most I ever did at one particular time was 8 years, but I did a lot of 1 year, 2 years, 6 months, things of that nature.
It's unbelievable. Salim, why are we still having this conversation? Why are we still talking about, why is solitary confinement even still a thing when they realize it's been more than a century since the people who ran this prison said that it was a bad idea. It took them 80 years to figure that out, but when they finally did, they gave it up here. One of your excellent speakers outside your rally stated pretty well that they got rid of it, and then they brought it back, and they brought it back in time for Mr. Reese to experience it here in this building. Why are we still having this conversation?
Several reasons. One is it's convenient. The prison system treats human beings as disposable. The courts treat human beings as disposable. A lot of people who are placed in solitary confinement are people who have mental health issues. We don't even treat people suffering from mental health issues out here on the streets, right? So you could just imagine on the inside, how do you treat someone who's dealing with mental health issues? You put them in the hole. We don't have to treat you. You're in there for 23 hours a day, 1 hour out for exercise on the weekdays, and you're in your cell 24 hours on the weekends. That's one factor. Another factor is that solitary confinement returned with a vengeance in the 60s. At the same time, the civil rights and the Black Power movement was going on in society. And during that time, you also had a very active prisoner rights movement where prisoners were advocating for simple things, right? To be treated with dignity, but also to be allowed to challenge the conditions of their confinement and their convictions in court. Because it may sound incredible But at one time in this country, if you wanted to challenge your criminal conviction, you had to submit approval from the prison warden in order to submit the habeas corpus to the courts, right? The 60s changed a lot of that. Prisoners were able to go into a federal court, assert their civil rights, and they were also able to go into the criminal courts and start appealing their unjust convictions. So the reason why we're having this conversation is that the prison system uses solitary confinement as a convenient way to deal with people who have mental health issues, but also prison officials, if you're a hammer, you see everything as a nail. And that is how the prison system deals with everything. So for example, people will be surprised to know that there are alternatives to solitary confinement available that the prison system doesn't use, right? So for someone who would pass food in the chow hall, instead of placing them in the hole for 30, 45, 60, or 90 days, they can literally just place them on cell restriction, limited movement, phone restriction, commissary restriction, yard restriction. So they could take away these little privileges that you have on the inside for that. But because prisons operate from a force model, and a lot of it plays into how the police operate from a war model, right? It's the same thing within the prisons. It's a very convenient way to control people, although it doesn't really necessarily control people. It really drives them crazy. And also, there is a lack of political will, and then there's also a lack of awareness. Because when we talk to legislators or when you talk to people about this, a lot of them are in shock about the numbers around people who are placed in solitary confinement, like how long they could be placed in solitary confinement for just.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you give us a few of those numbers?
So a few of those numbers are, for each prison infraction, you can be given 90 days. But if you have 3 infractions on 1 misconduct, that's 9 months, right? And they could stack those infractions. But here's the other thing. And listen, I've known people who had 5 infractions on 1 misconduct and have gotten 14, 16 months in the hole just for 1 misconduct because they could stack the charges, refusing to obey an order, unauthorized area, inappropriate language, right? So if you talk back to the staff and say, yo, what are you talking about? That's not true. Oh, that's inappropriate language. That's another 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days, depending on how the examiner wants to stack these. But the other thing is that you actually don't have to do anything to be placed in solitary confinement. The majority of the time that I spent in solitary confinement of those 10 years, I would say 80% of that was on administrative custody. And that is a status where they can take you out of general population and put you in the hole, not just for suspicion, but for any reasons that they pull out of the hat. So it could be a rumor that they could put you in solitary confinement. It could be like Mr. Reese says, because of your political beliefs, right? So for me, I was someone who filed lawsuits and filed grievances against prison abuse, or when my mail was denied, or against injustice in general in the prison system. The way they responded to that was they would place me in the hole and say, I'm a disruptive influence on the general population, that I'm doing unauthorized group activity by educating prisoners on the law. Now, they wouldn't necessarily say that you're educating prisoners to use the law to better themselves and to challenge prison conditions. They would cloak it in terms that you're an agitator, you're disrupting the orderly running of the prisons. So there's so many. I mean, I'll be honest with you, Sean, they literally, I'll give you an example. I was sent to SCI Green, the Supermax, in 2003. And I remember talking to one of the majors up there, and they had just put an H code on me, which was a high-risk prisoner code. And this meant that my mail was monitored. I was under increased movement. And this was only because of my advocacy within prison. But I remember asking the major, like, look, man, you know this is not right. You know I haven't had a misconduct in 2-3 years. He said, look, Holbrook, I'm gonna be straight with you. He said, I could literally walk down this compound and just throw H codes at people randomly and they will be assigned, right? He said, for any reason. He said, we don't need a reason. And the reason a lot of them were doing that because by classifying prisoners as high-risk prisoners, it was allowing the prison to have a higher security classification, which meant that they got more money for that, right? So it's so many different reasons that contribute to this. All of them which really bring the point home is that this is not just about solitary confinement. This is about the carceral state. And solitary confinement is one component of it that we have to dismantle and end. And it's also a component that really impacts us because a lot of people who are in solitary confinement are coming back to our communities, and they're coming back more harmed than they were when they came home. And they're coming back to a society that places minimal emphasis on people's mental health.
We're gonna come back to that too. Thank you for all that. That's very troubling, but interesting. Cynthia, what do people not understand? We were talking before we came on air about you're an influencer, and that you spend a lot of time talking with people who haven't experienced incarceration, what it's like. What is it? And Salim was telling us about how people don't understand. There's not this political will. There's not the public understanding of what's happening behind these prison walls. People I know who are incarcerated sometimes will tell me that the prison walls don't just keep the incarcerated folks in; they keep the public out. You know, and that's a part of the system too. So, what do you find out here among those of us who've never been incarcerated? What do you find that people's biggest misconception is about what happens behind prison walls?
I think, like, touching on what Salim said, first of all, the majority of all the time that I spent in solitary confinement was not because I did something wrong. It was just because of, I was held in administrative segregation because of my charges. I wasn't even convicted at the time. So I was being held in solitary for something I did nothing wrong. I refused to lock in one time because they wanted to house me with somebody who was schizophrenic, and I was afraid. So I refused to go in. I believe that solitary confinement, what a lot of people, when they hear it, they become afraid. They're like, oh my God, they must have done something wrong, or they probably hurt somebody. And what I respond when I tell them is that, this is a mechanism that is being used that is hurting people, right? It is a mechanism that if you cannot use it in the right way by not hurting people, then you cannot just simply say, okay, well, because 5 people are doing something wrong, we must use it for everyone, right? So I often tell people that solitary confinement is something that they use to perpetuate the idea that people in prison are dangerous, right? Because now you have a record, now you have 4 misconducts, now you're going to get a parole violation, which perpetuates prisons, and it keeps, prison officials employed. So it is in the best interest of the officer to write misconducts, because in their little small, towns where they have nepotism and, the prison system is their biggest employer, now you have, it's kind of like, police officers, they have to meet a quota. Same thing with prison officials. If they didn't write people up, then why should society be afraid of us in prison, right? I mean, that making sense? So I believe that it is used, to perpetuate this mass incarceration, which is, an extension of slavery as we all know it, to say, hey, they're dangerous. Look, she was in the hole for 240 days, but they never stopped to say, why was she in the hole for 240 days? I was in the hole 240 days because I spent half of it first before I was even convicted. I wasn't even guilty yet. And I was held there. Like if I was guilty, like if I did, even if I was guilty, it was still horrible to place me in that state, And then I was placed again in that state because of what somebody else did. So they violated, my 8th Amendment, my 14th Amendment. They violated all of my rights. And then you have, some of my comrades upstate that were placed in solitary because they couldn't push their wheelchair fast enough. So now they get a misconduct for disobeying an order. And that was a 30-day, stay in solitary. And the lady that I witnessed that day, because I used to work in the hospital, the prison, I witnessed the doctor telling her, you're a drug addict, you just want pills, go back to your unit. And she literally was telling the officer, I cannot physically push my chair. And they handcuffed her, they took her to the hole, and she later died alone. And I've witnessed somebody else who had mental health issues. When I worked at the hospital of the prison, I brought her her food. You know, she was my sister, she was my comrade. I didn't care what she did. She was a person in my eyes. And when she opened her tray, she realized that there was jello on her food, and she started to spaz out because she was allergic to jello. And I begged the officer, please let me walk and let me get her a tray. Please let me go to the kitchen. It's 2 seconds from here. And he told me no. And she killed herself that night. So what I believe people don't understand is that they're going by this idea, this false narrative that people in prison are dangerous. A lot of people that are in prison are traumatized. We are product of poverty. It doesn't let us off the hook for things that we do, but we must take into consideration that when you don't have money, people do strange things to survive. And when you don't have the best upbringing, like myself, I was a product of domestic violence in my home. I never knew what love was. So you look for love in all the wrong places. And, we're being criminalized for being poor. And then we are traumatized while we are in prison, to perpetuate this false narrative that we are, as Black and brown or poor white people, dangerous. And I hate prisons. I often try to change people's minds about prison, and I am doing a great job at it. And I will not stop until I see them knocked the hell down.
Thank you again for sharing those stories. I can see why you're so effective at what you do.
Thank you.
Mr. Reese, you witnessed the birth of mass incarceration. If you came here in 1967, that was, when
I was locked up in 1967, and I was at Holmesburg
Holmesburg,
in 1969.
Well, you really caught the tail end. When people come for a tour of Eastern State Penitentiary, they often say, why are we doing mass incarceration? And there's no real answer to that. It's a series of decisions made by hundreds of legislators and judges and prosecutors and so forth. But we do talk about how it happened, and that's pretty clear. And it happened kind of right there during your life.
Yes, and when I came,
all those laws were coming into place. Yeah, please go. I'm curious how things changed. You witnessed this complete sea change of when you came in. There was the per capita incarceration rate wasn't that high, and by the time you left, it was what we see today. This massive, nothing like it on earth.
right.
So please tell us how it changed while through your eyes.
All right. When I came in, there was a total in the state of Pennsylvania 8 jails, and that was including Muncie. All the cells were single cells. All the cells were single cells. There was no institution or no prisons that had cell partners. There was a single man to a cell. When I first come in, there was institutions that whole blocks, nobody was on that block. Blocks was just empty. Then while I was incarcerated, so many jails started sprouting up that I lost count. It's over. It was, like I said, it was 8 jails. My last count was something like 20 something, but I know it's more now. I know it's more than 20.
I think it's 27 then.
Yeah, but like I said, when I first came, it was just 8, and that's including Muncie. Prison had become big business, not because people in society actually deserve to be in jail. There's other mechanisms that can be used, I think, to prevent crime alone, and also to deal with those who may commit crime. There's other things that I think need to be put in place. With myself, I'm just going to speak from a personal standpoint. I got locked up for what you would consider a gang war homicide. I resent the fact that I took a person's life. I'm not going to justify that. I was 16, and I think that the system could have dealt with me better. I think I should have been placed in a juvenile facility opposed to placing me in an adult facility. And oh wow, I'm mentally numb. I'm mentally numb because I think I should have been dealt with differently, and I know other men that I've seen who went through the experience that they too should have been dealt with differently. I seen a guy when I was in the hole at Gradford. He was 18, and I was excuse me. I was 19 and he was 20. He got locked up in Gradford for having contraband. The contraband was, I think it was a radio. He had a radio. They placed him in a hole. He was in a hole for 2 days. He was sentenced for 30 days. He was in a hole for 2 days and hung himself for having a radio that they considered was contraband, and he was sentenced to the hole for 30 days. He could not, his mind could not handle being confined in a cell like that. I've seen people go crazy for being in solitary confinement. It's just ridiculous.
All three of you have witnessed people taking their lives or seen it happen. You didn't literally see it with your eyes following solitary or during solitary. It's really extraordinary. I'm worried about running out of time before we ask a little bit about your work at the Abolitionist Law Center. So Salim, can you just tell us a little bit about why you chose this? To remind the audience, you are the executive director. Why you chose solitary, why now, why this campaign, and what's your other work, other projects that the center is working on?
Well, solitary confinement is central to the founding of the Abolitionist Law Center. Abolitionist Law Center actually came out of the Human Rights Coalition, and the Human Rights Coalition was an advocacy organization founded by prisoners and our families in 2001 in Pennsylvania's prisons, and we were in solitary confinement. I'm one of the co-founders. Lukman, one of the speakers outside, was also one of the co-founders, and our family members were part of it. Brett Grody, who's the legal director of the Abolitionist Law Center, was a volunteer with the Human Rights Coalition Pittsburgh chapter, and he was investigating solitary confinement abuse in the prisons. And because all of us had personal experience with solitary confinement, and at the time of HRC's founding, all of us were on long-term solitary confinement. Advocating to end solitary confinement is pretty much in the Abolitionist Law Center's DNA, but also because solitary confinement is state violence. It is a violent act upon human beings. And when we think about violence, I'm sure a lot of people thinking of actual physical violence, but the impact from solitary confinement on a human being's mental stability, the mental trauma it does is just as good as if you were hitting them upside their head. So for us, our campaigns are several. There are litigation to end solitary confinement, and we've been successful with our partners. We were successful in ending solitary confinement for death row prisoners in Pennsylvania, along with the ACLU and the David Radofsky firm in Philadelphia. We partnered with them on that. And a lot of people don't know, but people who were on death row were in solitary confinement for many cases 30 years. And we just ended that. We've been very successful in representing prisoners who are in solitary confinement, political prisoners like Russell Maroon Schultz, who was in the hole for 30 years. We were able to get him out of the hole through litigation. And in one of the incredible cases, which really illustrates the absurdity of solitary confinement, case of Arthur Chetaway Johnson, another politicized prisoner in Pennsylvania, was in solitary confinement for 38 years. We were able to go to court and bring him out of solitary confinement. We're hoping to bring him home. We also have represented family members, and this is just a really unfortunate side of prisoners who killed themselves in solitary confinement, who were driven to kill themselves in solitary confinement. Now, for us, accountability would only be abolishing solitary confinement. But what we do is try and make sure that families know that the system is being held accountable, and whatever type of compensation can be had for these family members who lost loved ones is given, is due. We also have our waging legislative campaigns and supporting legislation, but more importantly, supporting awareness to help facilitate legislation of House Bill 1037 and Senate Bill 685 that will end long-term solitary confinement in Pennsylvania, will limit it to 15 days. Now listen, as someone who spent years in solitary confinement, I'm sure all of us on this panel, Donald and Cindy, would say 1 day is even too much. But we also understand that if we can limit it to 15 days, then that is a start. And for us, that's harm reduction. Because if I had the option of spending 3 years straight in solitary confinement or 15 days in solitary confinement, I could tell you I would have much preferred that 15 days. And it would have probably done, it wouldn't have done the damage to me and many other prisoners and human beings spending months and years in the hole is doing. So that is something that we are supporting. That legislation sponsored by Senator John Kane and State Representative Tina Davis, those bills would prohibit children from being placed in solitary confinement, minors as well under the age of 21, prohibit seniors from being placed in solitary confinement, prohibit members of the LGBT community from being placed in solitary confinement. Now, some people may ask, may be very reactionary and say, well, why do members of the LGBT community need special protections? And I'll tell you why. Because members of the LGBT community are some of the most oppressed people inside of prison. And the way the prison system deals with trans prisoners and also many LGBT community people is it places them in solitary confinement. And they are also in some cases, unfortunately, driven into solitary confinement by the homophobia in prisons, which is not unique to prisons because let's be straight, this is a problem within our society. But this would prohibit members of the LGBT community from being placed in solitary confinement. So that's something that we're getting behind as well. But our ultimate objective is to abolish solitary confinement.
We're running short on time, and I want to get back, before we go, I definitely want to get back to how people can support your work. We have two questions that are very similar, both asking, how are you taking care of your own mental and emotional health now that all three of you have experienced solitary? And since we're running out of time, I'm going to ask that we keep this pretty quick, but people do want to know what the three of you are doing to care for yourselves now that you've experienced this. Cynthia, do you want to start us off?
Yes. So first of all, I was wrongfully convicted. I spent 12 years as a lifer. I just been home for a little bit over a year. I came out 2021, not 2019, and I haven't been able to see a therapist. I do a lot of self-dialogue, like I did in prison with Socrates, self-dialogue. But every day is a struggle. I'm never going to be the same person, but like everything else in life, I'm just going to keep fighting, and I'm just going to keep spreading awareness until it's changed. But in the same time, I am seeking some therapy, and I need to help deal with these scars that I have. So every day is just a struggle, just how I was in prison. But thank you for the question. Yeah,
that was a question from Facebook. And actually two people on Facebook asked very similar questions, one of whom was formerly incarcerated themselves. Donald, Mr. Reese, what are you doing to care for yourself after this experience of all those years in solitary? How are you caring for yourself?
I try to be a community activist. I don't want young folks to go through what I went through. So I try to involve myself in to help heal the community. I do food distributions. I'm part of an organization called Black Male Community Council of Philadelphia. We try to deal with the violence that's going on in the community, the rising violence, gun violence issues. That's the things that I do to heal me too.
I was going to ask that. So that's something that you do to help heal your own soul. You find helping others sounds like
Yeah.
it's helpful to heal yourself as well. Salim, anything to add? You're doing.
I would say that the same thing with Mr. Reese. I throw myself into the work, but I also have a very strong, supportive family, and I do take care of myself physically, and make sure, more importantly, I take time for myself. And I think I could speak for some of us here on this panel that we do know how to take time for ourselves when we can, enjoy ourselves, and just get the pleasures out of life that people take for granted. Sometimes I tell people, for me, just going and getting a cold root beer when I want to is a form of self-care for so long, because it was denied me. Being able to just get up at night, walk out, open my front door, stand on the porch, look up at the sky, and just take in the air and just watch cars drive down the street is a form of self-care.
Mm-hmm.
So those are things that I encourage people who come home: enjoy your life, enjoy yourself, and make the best of each moment.
Cynthia, you're laughing. It sounds like that rang true for you. Is that something that you think about as well?
Yeah, because when he said just getting the soda, like, you're deprived so much in prison and just the small, simple things. But really quick, I wanted to add as well, like I do a lot of advocacy work on Instagram, and I spread a lot of awareness, and it brings me a lot of healing to know that I could either save somebody from, going to prison or ending their lives or things like that. So I do get a lot of healing from that. But there's still so much, sadness inside, because I just obviously just came home. So just trying to process everything. But I don't take life for granted. I take just walking to the store for me is, a privilege, because it was denied to me for 12 years. And I know that some of my comrades are in there being denied tissue, being denied just going to the water fountain. So I do not take life for granted. And so I'm smiling.
Thank you all for those generous answers. We are running down on time. I want to make sure that we circle back to how people can help. And let's start with this specific issue. And then I also want to make sure that we give a shout out to the Abolitionist Law Center and how to support the organization itself. But you mentioned some House bills. Salim, do you mind running through those one more time? I should have made a slide to put these on the screen. What are those House bills and how can people support them?
So the House bill is HB 1037, sponsored by State Representative Tina Davis, and its companion in the Pennsylvania Senate is Senate Bill 685, sponsored by Senator John King. We would ask people to contact their legislators, contact their local state representative and their local state senator, and call them, email them, tweet at them, ask them to support these bills to stop solitary in Pennsylvania. House Bill 1037 and Senate Bill 685. Those are some ways that we could use some support right now, because the only way we can roll back solitary confinement right now is through legislation in Pennsylvania and litigation. Right now, this campaign is a legislative campaign. That is how we are trying to roll it back, by supporting and raising awareness of these two bills. And this is how the communities can get involved directly into the campaign, by doing this. Also by following the Human Rights Coalition on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. Also follow the Abolitionist Law Center on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and also follow the magnificent Cynthia Alvarado on Instagram. I will let her give her Instagram, Joan, because I'm old. I don't know, about the handles and all that stuff.
Can I say my Instagram now? So you can find me on Instagram, Cynthia_221, which is my birthday. And there's a lot of interesting videos of my experiences in prison and us, speeches that I have given, and I'm very proud of my work. I've been able to save people from ending their lives. I've been inspiring the men of what I hear in prison. I'm like a hero to them. So I was shocked to even hear that, but it's something is working, and I'm not gonna stop until I'm able to save somebody from going to that hell, or until that hell is torn the hell down. And support Salim as well, and everybody here for just even having us. Has been amazing. Thank you.
And just one thing too, Sean, I want to, because Mr. Reese is quiet, and I could tell you, I was one of those young brothers that he influenced on the inside. I was one of them young men that he influenced on the inside, and there's so many of us home today who we are doing this work, and I'm sure it was older prisoners too that influenced him, right? So I just want to lift that up, because he was someone that all of us coming through from North Philadelphia knew about, and he gave us a very positive model of being a man in an environment that basically told you to be everything other than a human being.
Hmm.
And treated you in ways completely opposite of what you would treat a human being.
We should do a Searchlight sometime on mentorship behind the walls. It's something that comes up in half of the Searchlights we have. The topic of mentorship, it's just clearly in the work. Again, I've never been incarcerated, but we've done many projects inside of prisons. Not many, enough. I've spent a fair bit of time inside prisons, and it's just something you just see that I think that must just be a human reaction. I always wonder if it's probably a part of prison life across time and across cultures, something about the experience of people who are denied freedom, the way that people try to find meaning in those environments. If the three of you have a few minutes, we have a fascinating question. We're at time. I would love to take 5 more minutes though, and get your response to something that someone wrote here. One of our former interns, John McCullough, wrote, I'm a former intern at Eastern State Penitentiary here at the historic site, and a superintendent of a state prison. I tend to agree that RHU was overused and one should never be there for radio. But in my career, it was sometimes necessary to remove individuals from population because they were a danger to others, and it was unfair to the general population to be terrorized by a predator. Please comment.
Can I go first, please? Because I'm so excited to go first.
Yeah, I want to also just thank John, because it's nice to actually get that other perspective. It was actually one of my questions was to ask you sort of, what would you say to a question like this? So,
Yeah.
But we have someone from actual corrections professional here asking. So please, Cynthia.
Yes. First of all, I want to say that I have never been so traumatized, and it has been by guard, not by inmates. So if we're going to talk about that issue, we must be honest. I was physically raped by a guard, and I was beaten. So if we're going to use the overall mechanism of punishment with solitary for just a few people, then why are we not doing it for the guards? Because they're never held accountable for anything. And a lot of times when inmates or people that are incarcerated do things, it's either because it's a mental health issue, or a lot of times it's because they're agitated by the guards. So I feel like the conversation is not really, it's not 100% truthful. Maybe in some situations, yes, somebody may be dangerous, but there's also different ways to go about it. Locking somebody in a cage does not help you, I promise you. It only makes you worse, and it makes you hate. It makes you want to kill yourself and maybe harm others. So, I mean, I don't know what to say, but if we're gonna have those conversations, let's be honest about the conversations. Completely honest, not just cherry pick what we feel is good and what is not.
Can I comment to that?
Of course. Please, Mr. Reese.
I got a reflection. And I recall back in 1973, an inmate accused me of being a threat to him sexually. And he used this as a way of trying to get to another institution. We was not in the same surroundings. He was on quarantine and I was in general population. There was no interaction. but he was trying to get to another institution. They locked me up, placed me in the hole, giving me a misconduct, and I was found to be not guilty of the misconduct because they knew that we was not in this, that there was no way we could physically touch. But what they did was they transferred me instead of him, and they sent me to another institution, but I did 8 months in the hole. And I was never found guilty of the misconduct, but the misconduct is in my record, is in my jacket, even though I wasn't found guilty of being a predator. He made an accusation, and they knew that the accusation was false, but it was some guards who didn't like me, still treated me as if I was found guilty of the misconduct. They transferred me out and kept him there.
I mean, can I add on that too? One thing, I think that the question that was asked, we could probably have a whole panel on this, right?
Yeah, I think the same thing.
Right? But there's several things here. One is Colorado was able to roll back solitary confinement, right? And it was able to segregate or separate some of those prisoners who may have needed more closer supervision, right? And I'll be straight, between the ages of 17 and 22, I was probably one of those prisoners, right, that needed that type of separation. But we did not need to be locked down 23-1, right? And more importantly, we were placed into a prison culture that bred this type of mentality. And that is the story, or that is how we should look at this. Yeah, there may be some prisoners who may need to be separated, right? But we don't need to lock them in a cell for 23 hours a day, coming out 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, locked down 24 hours on the weekend. We could still treat them with dignity. We could still give them contact visits. We can still provide them education opportunities. So that would be my answer to your former intern and the former superintendent. But it's also something I would like to seriously debate more about, that issue as well. Because like I said, other countries and other states have used different type of measures to deal with people who are deemed incorrigible. And I'll say this is that I was one of those incorrigibles, right? But I am who I am today in spite of the hole in solitary confinement, because I was very fortunate that being in those units, I did not depend on solitary confinement to correct me, because it didn't. That it only made me worse. I was very fortunate that I had other prisoners there who were able to lower my temperature, like Mr. Reese and others, and guide me out. It's not a coincidence that the number of prisoners who go into solitary confinement are a small minority in the prison. I remember they used to tell me, Holbert, we should leave your door tag back here, and you and some other guys, because you guys just keep coming in back and forth. That small percentage is because of the trauma that cycles you in and out. I was fortunate to break that trauma. So I would encourage the Department of Corrections to invest some of that money and resources to figure out how to break that trauma, right? Where that small percentage of prisoners continues recycling in and out of the hole. Because I was one of them, but the DOC didn't do it for me. People like Mr. Reese and my maturity did. So Sean, that would be a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, we might have to pick up on that another night. We've gone over time. I just want to say one last thing. Oh, really quickly, two last things. One, someone on Facebook asked, when is there a vote on those two bills? I suspect they're not up for a vote yet. They're probably waiting to get out, but please.
Yeah, they're not out of committee yet. What we need to do is have more co-sponsors and more legislators sign on to show that there's support for it. So we would encourage people to just contact your legislators and get as many to sign on as possible.
Thank you so much. I just want to acknowledge that all four of us are here at Eastern State Penitentiary at the historic site. When I contacted Salim 6 months ago, I was hoping we'd have an audience here tonight. And so thank you for your patience, all three of you, that I got you all here in the building, but we just couldn't quite get the technology to get the audience here as well. So we're sitting like 5 feet away from each other, but so we don't get echoes on our laptops or in different, I can actually see you guys, but anyway, thank you for your patience. I know this isn't exactly how I promised it would be, but we'll have an audience back here in the building sooner rather than later. And thank you for all of your advocacy work. Thank you for the Abolitionist Law Center for your rally today, for being here tonight. We'll see you tomorrow for a press conference in support of this bill. We are proud partners with you, and we respect your work, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you, Sean.
And with that, this is good night. Thank you from Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.